Welcome to another episode of Meal Prep Monday. I'm your host and founder of Prep Dish, Allison Schaaf. Today, I'm continuing the conversation about road trips, and this time specifically talking about planning out snacks and meals while on the road and traveling with your family. Before we get into today's content, a reminder that if you have not tried out our time-saving meal prep meal plans, we have created a 2-week free trial. So that way you can get on and just see what it's like to have someone else plan your meals. It's prepdish.com/MPM. When you sign up, you will get access to a login to a variety of meal plans, everything from low carb, paleo, gluten-free, but then also our super fast plans. And if you're brand new, I really suggest starting with these. These are just healthy, family-friendly meals that are really quick and easy. So if you can find 1 hour of time to do some light prep work, then your meals are basically going to be ready for the week. And at mealtime, you won't have to think and all of the heavy lifting will be done. You just have to follow some quick and easy instructions or even hand the instructions off to someone else and your dinners will be ready in no time. These are all healthy meals, but more importantly, we always put taste and flavor first. I am a big believer that in order to eat healthy, we have to first make sure the food tastes good. Otherwise, it's just not going to be sustainable. The kids won't go for all of the things. So again, these are really tasty meals. This is how I make sure I get dinner on the table stress-free each night in my household. So if you want to try it out for 2 weeks, go to prepdish.com/MPM. Okay, so today's episode, this is a continuation from last week where I talked about planning a road trip with kids or even just planning a road trip in general. So I know not all of you listening have, little ones at home. So even if you're just planning a road trip for yourself or maybe like a girls' road trip, whatever it is, go back to that episode. Today, we're going to focus more on the foods and snacks. But last week's episode, I got into all of the, planning out the route that you were going to take and places to stay and all of that. And when I was wrapping up the episode, I got into a little bit into finding a routine while on the road. But I'm going to get more into that today because that also then just goes into the routine, but then also meals and snacks and how to handle that. So when it comes to meals and snacks, I don't even want to pretend like I have it all figured out. There's definitely a little more scrambling that sometimes happens when on the road. And also just finding the balance of eating out versus eating in. It's nice to eat out when you're traveling sometimes. I mean, just logistically, it's sometimes impossible to be eating in a hotel room or, maybe you're driving and so you have to figure something out. We did try for our meals, I think we almost always would sit down for meals. I like that even without kids, but I think with the kids, it's nice that we still stick with that routine of breakfast, lunch, dinner. Breakfast, we did tend to always have at either the Airbnb or the hotels. So the hotels, as I mentioned in last week's episode, we would, if we stayed at a hotel, it was always, always a Marriott property, and they do have an included breakfast. And that's something we would look for just because that made things a lot easier, that we didn't have to find a separate place to go out and find breakfast. And, I think sometimes if you're traveling and staying in the same location, it can be fun to go find a cute little breakfast spot. But it's good to have some meals that are just easy and you don't have to go out searching for things. So yes, breakfast was usually at the hotel or the Airbnb. And then a lot of the meals, because this trip was so heavy and meeting up with friends and family, so we would do a lot of meals with them. And so they were kind of planned out. Sometimes they would choose a location or it would be at someone's house, which was great. I think, especially with little ones, it can be nice just to be at someone's house. So there's less pressure to like sit down and have the meal. And, and I will say, so one of my tips because there was a lot of eating out at like restaurants, a lot of times with the kids, you kind of have to take into an account like their age, what they're capable of. So our expectation is not always like, okay, we enter the restaurant, the kids sit down, they wait for, 30 minutes for the food to come. They, sit patiently, they eat patiently, and then sit afterwards while the adults continue to chit chat for another like 30 minutes. What we often do is when we get there, instead of having them sit down at the table right away, one of us will take the kids like out if there's some place we can take them so that they can kind of not be seated right away. Often what this looks like is if it's just us as a family, my husband will take the kids, he'll go out, find some place to take them to get some energy out. I will sit down, just order food for the entire family. And then when the food comes, he brings them in. And then that way they are capable of sitting down and enjoying, the entire meal because they haven't been already sitting and waiting for, 15, 20 minutes. So they're able to like, sit down. It's very similar to what the expectation is at home, right? Like dinner's ready, they come, they sit down, they eat the meal. So that's something that I know is realistic. And then same thing after the meal. So we did have, other meals though, where we were with people. So they would kind of, sit down and wait. But then maybe when the meal was done, like there was one where we were visiting and it was my cousin. And so rather than like trying to, not force, but like expect them to then continue to sit after the meal and like do all this catching up and chit chat, my husband said, hey, I'm going to take off early. There's a playground halfway between the restaurant and our Airbnb. I'll take them to the playground. You stay and catch up with your cousin. And on the flip side, there was a meal when we were with some of his relatives. And, towards the end of the meal, I got up and kind of walked around with the boys. So that way they weren't just, sitting at the table. And I don't know, I think just being realistic of what you can expect. And then that's one of the tricks to like getting them to eat out is like not having that expectation so high that it's like not realistic for their age. I think at 2.5, yes, like sitting down and eating a meal, but sitting down, eating a meal and like then being patient and just sitting down for over an hour, maybe that's more than they're ready for right now. So kind of a tangent, but maybe that'll help some of you realize when I say, yes, we take our kids out to eat and they do great. It's because we also kind of work with them and don't always have the expectations so high that they're unattainable. So this is a huge trick for meals, especially, probably only if someone in your family is gluten-free. We used the Find Me Gluten app, and this is really amazing in a few ways. Kind of like I mentioned in last week's episode, like knowing that when we go to a hotel and we're only going to be there one night, we look for the bonvoy, we look for, like one of two different kinds of hotels. It just kind of narrows it down immediately. And like, there's not so many decisions and it makes the decision easier. Because that's one of the tricky parts with travels. There's so many decisions that it's better if you start from, hey, here's a few options versus like, unlimited options, because that can be overwhelming. So the Find Me Gluten app is great because it will show you all of the gluten-free restaurants in a given area. And, and I think most restaurants these days are pretty easy to go in and find something I can eat. But it is nice that this app kind of narrows down those selections to ones that I know I won't have any difficulty with. And especially, so like, for example, when we went to Maine, it was great because it showed me like, hey, here's a lobster place where you can get a lobster roll, right? Like if I'm going to Maine, like I want to get a lobster roll and I want to get it on a roll and not just like in a lettuce wrap, right? Like I want to have the real experience. So that was great that I could get on and there's reviews so I can read through the reviews. And that is an app that we use a lot when eating out, especially when traveling, to just find spots and kind of see people's real, their feedback and what they, what to order and what's gluten-free. Do they have things like gluten-free buns or gluten-free pasta? So that just helped me have kind of more of an authentic experience. When we spent a night in Princeton and when we were there, I saw there was a crepe place that had really great reviews for gluten-free crepes. So that was fun that we got to go out and just ordered, 4 different crepes and split those, all amongst us for breakfast. And I don't know. So it just led to some restaurants that we otherwise, I probably wouldn't have otherwise looked at the crepe place and been like, oh, I wonder if they have gluten free. Like I would just be like, oh, that probably isn't like the best option. But because I found it through that app, I knew that going into it, they were going to have options that we could all have, and it would make it a more, fun experience for the whole family. So if you have someone that's gluten-free in your family, I highly recommend that app because our meal plans, we were started as a gluten-free meal planning service. I know that some of you listening have someone in your family that is gluten-free. So that's why I think it's, worth mentioning in case that's something, but that's something that we use. I've also sometimes used Open Table as a way to find restaurants. This has been more travel that I've done without kids. Like if I'm looking for a restaurant for my husband and I to eat out. And there I actually don't always look for the keyword gluten-free. A lot of times the terms I will use are farm to table is a term that I like to use. And I feel like that finds some restaurants that are sort of what I'm looking for. So I've just kind of, I don't know, learned different kind of searching ways to search for restaurants because that can be a little bit tricky. But for me, that's also a fun part of the travel. But again, with something like a road trip where it's so many different locations and so much, it can be a lot. And that I don't do in advance. So there's a decent amount of the travel research that I'm not doing in advance and I'm kind of doing in real time. I think it's just kind of easier to get there. And yes, I'm sure it would be helpful if I did it all in advance and I got there and like, oh, here's the list, here's 3 different spots. But then some of that research ends up being unnecessary because there's a lot of times you end up eating less meals than you think you will. I don't know, it kind of ends up being not, maybe you end up having, an Airbnb and you can just eat there, or, something just, you come across something that's like, oh, this works out great. But one more that I have to tell you was through the Find Me Gluten-Free app, we found, was it in upstate New York or maybe in Connecticut? We found a random, well, it wasn't random because we found it through this gluten-free app, but it was this little diner that you would think would have nothing gluten-free. And instead, like everything was gluten-free, like the fries, they had pancakes, they had, just everything, and never would have stopped there or even considered it if it weren't for the Find Me Gluten-Free app. So yeah, we had a few little like hidden gems that we found through using that thing. I'd gone back and forth before getting into this episode if I wanted to have snacks be its own thing, and I'm thinking I do. So we are going to actually wrap up today's episode on meals and figuring that out. I will just touch on quickly at the Airbnb more when I stayed at places. Well, actually, 2 things. One, early on, I wish we would have made it a point to find a cooler and traveled with a cooler so that some of the staples we could have traveled with and had on hand when we stayed at places, things like butter or eggs or things like that we could have had in a cooler and not had to kind of like repurchase them throughout the trip. And then when we did stay in an Airbnb, I would try and find some time to go to a grocery store so that we could do, breakfast at the house. And I kind of have started to have my go-to, here's what I buy, here's the things I make to make it easy. A lot of times the grocery trip, I would either, this is specific if you have kids, I would try and either drop the kids off at the house, like my husband would stay with the kids at the Airbnb and I would go to the grocery store on my own, or we would do it. And if they were napping, he would just drive around the parking lot and I would go into the grocery store by myself. I guess the whole point of that is most of my trips to the grocery store, I found it much easier if I just went on my own without the kids, whether that meant they stayed in the car with their dad or went to the Airbnb. We just found that was a lot easier and quicker that way. So that is my final tip if you're cooking at an Airbnb, is to perhaps see if you can get a grocery trip by yourself. And for me, that was also just some nice time to be on my own because I think that's also important when you're doing a road trip with family, is to find some quiet time to yourself as well. So I'm going to wrap up today's episode there. I'm going to get more into eating on the road in next week's episode, where I'm going to talk specifically about snacks. A reminder that if you want to try out the Prep Dish meal plans, you can go to prepdish.com/mpm for 2 weeks for free. That's also linked in the show notes. And if you want to reach out to me, I'm at Prep Dish on Instagram, and we also have a Facebook group, which I will link in the show notes as well. That is all for this week. I will be back with you next Monday.